We are Antonia,
Vesna,
Gabriela Houston,
and Igor, and you're listening to More FM.
More FM with a special guest, as you heard, Gabriela, fellow Slavic fantasy author. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us on this very special episode. And can you tell us a few words about yourself so our audience can meet you from your words?
Thank you. I'm a Polish, UK-based author of Slavic folklore-inspired novels for adults and children. I have a couple novels out, The Second Bell and The Bone Roots, which are heavily influenced by the stories from my childhood, my part of the world, and also wrote books for children, The Wind Child and The Storm Child, the first of which actually came out in Croatian, so it's really lovely to be speaking to you guys. And last year, I actually self-published something for the first time. My first alternative history romance with folkloric elements, Riding the Cuckoo.
So you say folklore and folkloric a lot. Do you prefer it to fantasy or as a term?
It's okay. So the genre I write in is generally fantasy or like some subversion of the fantasy genre. But my books are heavily inspired by the existing folklore, and I'm mostly inspired by Slavic folklore in my writing, at least so far. I might venture out.
Would you call it Slavic fantasy? Because 2 years ago, we were actually recording a live show episode with the audience at the local convention where the theme was Slavic fantasy. And we tried to get to some definition with the audience, and we noticed that a lot of people have a different visions of what Slavic fantasy even means. So as an author who writes fantasy but heavily inspired by Slavic folklore, would you call yourself a Slavic fantasy writer? And if not, why not?
I think I just prefer to be a bit more specific in how I describe it and kind of linking it to Slavic folklore, because the way I see it, it's not, there's quite a few novels here and there written in the English language that are in, Slavic fantasy, as in it's a fantasy novel that borrows elements usually kind of in the aesthetic elements from Slavic cultures. So you might have someone called Igor, fighting the dwarves or whatever, and they might have a fur hat, but it's not actually deeply connected to Slavic culture. And the reason I'm being a bit more specific is because I'm very interested in kind of comparative mythologies. And like you, Vesna, actually, like I read, and you, Antonia, like I read Slavic stories growing up. And at least in Poland, when I was growing up, those were really limited for small children. Like, you would get picture books, storybooks about that had that kind of drawn inspiration from the local kind of stories and traditional oral storytelling. But as I was growing up, there was like nothing. There's nothing else about it. So the only things I could, I became interested. So I became interested in like ancient Greek mythologies and Norse mythologies and, ancient Egyptian mythologies and basically anything that was available. And coming back to Polish folklore and Slavic folklore, and I'll say in a moment why I keep a distinction, between the two when I talk about it. I approached it from like a comparative point of view. So when I think about how to describe my fiction, I'm thinking about the values that I root my stories in. So it's not just that I will introduce a character from Slavic folklore, but I think about maybe ethical underpinnings of the stories from this particular place. I really like to sort of observe how folklore represents values of a community, and those are so different between different places. So, when you look at the values represented in Norse mythology, in some ways, they're the opposite to the values that are instilled through most of Slavic folklore in terms of generosity to guests, responsibility towards guests, breaking bread, and the absolute responsibility that the host assumes over their guests, and also reciprocity, and keeping the bargains, not try, so the kind of contempt for tricksters in majority of at least Polish folkloric stories, whereas in the Norse stories, tricksters are rewarded often.
Yeah.
So things like that make me want to keep to the longer description. It's a bit of a roundabout explanation, I suppose, but I do prefer to keep my definition specific.
It's interesting explanation, really.
If I may be a bit perhaps impolite.
Go on. I mean, we're all Slavs here, so it's fine.
It's in our blood. When you say growing up, just to compare with Croatian experiences with children's tales and folklore used in kidlit and in books for adults, can you like date yourself without telling us the year you were born?
I'm 40.
Oh, you're 40. Okay, so
Okay.
no, I was gonna ask, were you old enough to go watch The Fellowship of the Ring by yourself in movies? Because we talked to a lot of people who weren't. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, so Gabriela is actually a year younger than me, but it's the thing where you're basically 90s kids, if we're gonna say it. In Poland and Croatia, probably a bit different. Regarding the influx of different cultures from the outside, because I know that Polish readers read a lot of Polish authors in Polish, right?
Nowadays.
I mean, in a way, they always have,
Okay.
but there's also been a huge amount of translated works. So obviously, we had a lot of Polish authors around, but we also it was perfectly normal to read translated works from Japan, China, English as well. But it was actually, when I think about the books I was reading, it wasn't even like a particular imbalance there, like in terms of like it was equal opportunities translation market. I don't know if it is now, to be honest. I think COVID's changed some things in the publishing industry in Poland, but I don't have as good an insight into that received from the outside. But you mentioned that in Croatia, was it mostly translations or?
It was the thing that I was actually building up to, because I was interested in whether when you were a kid, I will assume you read fantasy when you were a child as well, right?
I did, yeah.
So, okay, as you usually do when you start writing fantasy.
I mean, I read everything.
In Croatia, we had mostly translated works, because works by Croatian authors were not really looked upon kindly in the fantasy and science fiction genre. So yeah, so I was interested whether or not you were exposed to as much foreign authors as you were the Polish.
I probably, because of the particulars of my upbringing and especially my tastes in literature in the early years were quite heavily influenced by my dad. So I did read a lot of works in English, I suppose, and especially like in the fantasy genre specifically, I would say yes, I read more in English than I did in Polish. That is not to say that the works in Polish did not exist. They were obviously very popular, when it comes to like The Witcher, right? It was not The Witcher, like I like the comics that were based in the books, but the books themselves were not exactly my cup of tea, but they were clearly extremely popular, both in Poland and abroad. But it's interesting for you to hear that there were some like negative feelings among Croatian people towards Croatian authors. Would you tell me why?
The grass is always greener on the other side, I guess. In other people's yards.
Yeah, we have a culture that is really like we hate everything that comes from Croatia for some reason.
We're reversed snobbery. So everything foreign is by default somehow better than what you do, which is really weird.
Yeah.
But that's really interesting. I think there's a tension between elements of that in Poland, but there is still like a very strong sense of you have to know your own stuff before you start, criticizing it. But I wonder why, I suppose when it comes to certain subgenres, I think people would think of local works as maybe derivative. Maybe that's lacking in originality and being too rooted in Western counterparts. Could that be part of the reason, you think, as well?
I mean, that was part of the dislike during the 90s towards domestic authors and science fiction and fantasy, was that it was very derivative at points and very bad like objectively bad.
Oh wow, I can't say like so it was different. I did not get that sense in Poland that would be a feeling in Poland, I think.
But there's also a huge difference in the publishing industry as well, because the publishers weren't really keen on publishing Croatian science fiction fantasy authors.
Oh, so you think it wasn't market-led necessarily, but sort of publisher-led?
No. It wasn't. Croatia has this really, I think, to foreigners, probably fascinating way the publishing industry works, where a lot of the publishing is directly is subsidized by the government, by government. So not books necessarily that'll be bestsellers. It's books that publishers might think might get them government grants. It's
I see. It's a kind of twist on the concept of meritocracy here. Is that I see. Okay, so it's like what might get us awards. And there is I'm sure there's like advantages to that, because you see in the UK and in the US the publishers are rightfully so, in my opinion, criticized for focusing on very low quality works, ghost written works, that have a celebrity's name slapped on them, and more like footballers' biographies, things like that. So we're kind of and they're kind of moving away from trying to publish what one might call more ambitious literature. So there's sort of less variety maybe than people feel, that there's less variety than there used to be. There's after the initial excitement that publishers were finally looking to expand their lists more, to sort of introduce more diversity in voices as well, and to that they would start representing people from different parts of the world and different types of voices. And it did sort of quickly become apparent that publishing industry at large was just treating it as another trend, and now they've decided, okay, well, we've done that already, and now we can move on to something more profitable, which is such a ridiculous proposition to begin with, but it's so perhaps if they were otherwise motivated, it could be better, but who knows.
So we've made the jump from folklore to
publishing industry.
And a couple of years ago, when Antonia and I first published Slavic Supernatural Volume 1, the first anthology, we tried to define, with the help of our audience at one event, we tried to define the Slavic spirit.
So we got a question from the audience while we were talking about the stories that ended up in Volume 1. And the question was do you feel Slavic spirit in these stories? And we will but how would you define Slavic spirit? What do you expect from Slavic inspired story to have this so-called Slavic spirit? So since you mentioned Slavic values in comparison with other mythologies and folklores, do you have an idea how would you answer that question?
It's actually related to the publishing industry discussion. That's why we went this way.
I think it's a very hard question to answer, because which Slavs we're talking about, because there are huge differences, really. We have things in common, but there is, especially in the current political situation, there is a risk of going back to the concepts of pan-Slavicism in some ways, which, Russia did sort of push in the late 19th century as well, like partially in response to the independence movements in different parts of the kind of Slavic world. And Russian authors and intellectuals really pushed this pan-Slavicism, that we're really all one family of Slavs under the protective umbrella of, Great Mother Russia. That was the concept, right? So right now it feels politically fraught to be too hung up on pan-Slavicism. But there's also, there's a huge difference between pre-Christian Slavic folklore, which is what I focus on. This is my area of interest. I looked at the before Christianity, because the values in the folklore itself have really changed. So the kind of the ancient Slavs, we can call them, were a people with a completely different sets of ethics and different sets of values. So I can maybe talk a bit about those. And they were people who believed in reciprocity and a sense of fairness in dealings. So you had, you couldn't get something for nothing. You couldn't try to trick someone or something out of its labor, out of whatever deal you had struck. And there was also a very different concept of the human's place in the world. And that is something that is of great interest to me, in that obviously in kind of post-Christian influence, you have, people are the most important sort of creature, right? And all the animals and spirits are either subservient or almost antagonistic, right? Because you can have angels, and everything else was made into demons and devils. So suddenly all the fair dealings became problematic, because, if you can have a fair dealing with the spirit of a mountain, right? And the spirit of a mountain will help you find where the coal is or whatever, right? And then you give it bread with butter. And that is a fair dealing in pre-Christian times. However, in post-Christian times, you might enrich yourself through it, but then you go to hell, right? So there's this stories, and it's interesting. Sometimes, if you're really lucky, you can come across the same story with a kind of post-Christian ending, sort of tagged on at the end, which is really interesting. But how the whole value system was sort of tipped on its head. But when I talk about place in the world, I think ancient Slavs really understood that we all have our own spheres of existence. So our place is the home, the field. This is where we exist. And the moment you enter the wilderness, for example, that is no longer our place. So we have to be careful. We have to be respectful. And there is a sense of mutuality of respect towards animals as well as other creatures. Ancient Slavs believed that horses, for example, were on par with us in terms of like that we both had dual souls. So that horses, just like humans, had the immortal soul and the mortal soul. So that once you die, you travel for 40 days to Nawia, to the afterlife. I mean, the names shift between regions. So I'm just talking about the stories that I've read. So, and then the mortal soul goes to rest among the stars, and the immortal one gets reborn. And ancient Slavs believed that horses shared that characteristic with us. So there's already like a sense of respect. And I think respect is really big for ancient Slavs as a people.
I noticed your disclaimer that name changes in different type of stories. Always when I write something about like trivia for inspiration, I always mention that also, like, this version of a story, it's only one of the possible versions. And it's also correct for just like Croatian stories, where it can change from village to village. And it's
of course. And also with the ancient pantheon, I did a podcast a while back, and I interviewed this Dr. Francis Young. He is professor in ancient mythologies, and he did do sort of write on Slavic mythologies, but he focuses mostly on the bolts and the same issues that he is faced with, the scholars in ancient Slavic mythologies are faced with, which is that those were illiterate people. There was no real motivation from the Christianizing powers to preserve the stories in the original form, because Christianization was a pretty violent process in our part of the world. A lot of the kind of archaeological evidence was also destroyed. So people can approach it from either comparative mythologies, which, to be fair, Dr. Young was very disparaging of as a scientific method, or you can try to extrapolate from archaeological data and the currently existing stories and try to piece that together. But the result is that I have several books on Slavic mythologies, obviously, and they produce sometimes contradictory information. The same god, the same creature might be completely different depending on the author. And, I don't feel qualified to say which one is true. I just pick whatever is more interesting for my purposes.
Same. But it's also, I don't want anyone to at me or just send me an angry email like, you're wrong.
This is not Morana. This is
Yeah.
nobody's gonna say this is Lada for but
Honestly, the key is
mean-
not to care. If someone gets het up enough to write you an angry email that you're wrong, that means that they actually don't have enough knowledge on the subject to understand how contradictory certain sources are. So
it gets really complicated. But in Croatia, at least in the last couple of years, a lot of people are doing research on our folk tales. They're doing real work, finding elders, recording them, analyzing their stories, and publishing the work in a way that it wasn't, I mean...
It was just archived before. People went into the field and recorded the stories, but little analytic
work was done. But nowadays it's much easier to research also Croatian folk tales. Though we have we have a complicated history, obviously, when we were a part of Yugoslavia and the fall of that and so on. So a lot of it is also interchangeable, mixed together. I mean, when I was growing up, so I'm the 90s kid. I was growing up during the war and post-war for independence. So when I was reading my book of South Slavic folk tales, to me it was our folk tales. It was just like, I'm a kid, I have no idea about the politics around me. It's art.
Of course.
And then I learned later on that it's actually south, all of the like Croatia, Bosnia, and Serbia, and I had to like be careful what I'm mentioning because people are still a bit touchy if you, I don't know, appropriate the story from that's actually maybe from Serbia or Bosnia.
I think people are superimposing the current political feelings onto historical, but like so unnecessarily, I think there is one constant in human history, which is migration for one, and stories travel with us and then they kind of melt into something new entirely. So these are the stories you were told as a child. These are your stories as far as I'm concerned.
And also, like you said, there's always mixing of cultures. There's also Hungarian influence on our folk tales, and you can really see, they have this, we also have this, and you can really see all of the influences that used to be at these places.
I mean, when you think of like Indo-European family of languages as well, and I was reading there could be a lot of parallels drawn between Slavic mythologies, not the spirit worlds, like not the folkloric element so much, but the pantheon as we understand it might have existed seems to bear some striking similarities with Hindu pantheon, to be honest. The way people travel, like a lot of those stories are preserved in one form or another. So it's really interesting, actually, because we speak Indo-European family of languages. When I traveled in India, there's sometimes you come across like a word in Sanskrit, for example, or I heard like someone say something in Bengali, and I was like, why do I understand you? This is like, but there's like some like archaic form of a word, like in Sanskrit, 5 is piash, and in Polish it's pięć. Right?
It's in Croatian, it's pet, which exactly
similar, or like fire, ogni, and it's like ogień in Polish.
Ogień in Croatian.
You see, so we have a lot more in common, wider, and I think it's important to kind of understand why the differences exist, but also celebrate all of it.
Let's now go more into your writing and your books, because I think we could continue talking about just the folklore stuff. Probably for hours.
Welcome to Mora FM.
I have nowhere to be. Like,
So you mentioned you write both for the adults and for children. And what would you say when you go into inspiration behind the books you write? Do you go into a lot of research, and do you try to stay accurate to it, or you leave it to be more open? And is there something different between when you go and write for adult audience than for children. Not just the obvious difference, of course, but with the way that you approach maybe the folkloric inspiration.
That's a very big question that sets me up for like an hour's monologue.
The floor is yours.
So, I mean, I'll start with my debut, right? So, The Second Bell was a story about a mountain community where sometimes a child is born with two hearts, and such a child is considered to be a štriga, an abomination, a monster, and must be abandoned on the edge of a forest. And sometimes the mothers choose to leave with their babies and they're banished forever. And then they join the community of štrigas in the mountains. And so, obviously, the story follows such a mother and daughter. And of course, there's an exploration of like, the mother doesn't just, they all have this internalized hatred and fear of the štriga powers, right? So the community self-polices as well, the štriga community. And it's not a direct, it's not a retelling of a štriga myth, but I felt like I wanted to take the core of it. So I don't know how much sort of your listeners are familiar with the štriga myths, maybe from The Witcher.
Funny story, we have strigas in Croatia too, but they're a bit different than this type of myth you mentioned with two hearts, two souls. Ours is usually a woman born with magical powers, and she's usually perceived as a negative force, like a sort of a witch, someone who is here to
curse your cows,
curse
your milk.
Exactly, who is guilty for everything bad that's happening in the village, and she can shapeshift into animals.
That is very different, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. So in my part of the world, this sort of štriga myth is like štrigas are kind of straightforward monsters, right? But they're in some stories they have two hearts, some stories they have two sets of teeth. Sometimes they're cursed, sometimes they're born like that. And they basically act like bloodthirsty monsters. And I read one version of a story that I really enjoyed because I felt it felt quite unaffected by a lot of kind of later influences on the value system. And there was this simple boy hero kind of goes through the world, and he is just unfailingly kind to an animal, was caught in a trap, releases it, the animal will help him, again, there's like a reciprocity and like respect sense. So, he helps the spirit of this old dead man, by paying for his burial, all of us. And so he kind of accumulates all of those like good deeds along the way. And he comes to a castle where he's told that there's a cursed princess that turns into a štriga. And the way he cancels out the curse is it's similar to what people might have seen in like The Witcher, which is that he climbs into her coffin till the morning. But the story core that I really liked was that the way he breaks a curse isn't just by taking her spot in a coffin. He takes on her pain. So he climbs into this coffin, and in that moment, he understands her. He understands the fear that drives her, the incomprehension, the anger she doesn't control, the hunger she doesn't control. And he feels such intense empathy for her that it breaks the spell, and she's transformed back into a human. And so I kind of took that and sort of played with it. So quite aside from what štrigas are and what they're not, I wanted to focus on, well, the bond obviously between mother and child, but also on this sense of trying to understand the other that is different, and trying to kind of, just embody the fears and the pain of the other. So I want to stay true to the kind of kernel in the story. So I would much rather look for elements like this about like what's the value in this creature, rather than just, staying true to the description of it, for example, right? So there's, in my children's books, there's a lot more monsters. And there's a lot more straightforward influence from the kind of bestiaries and all of that. But again, it's I'm trying to stay true to the value system of those stories. So the reciprocity, the respect, the understanding that you have to know the rules, right? Because if you break the rules, it doesn't matter that you don't know what the rules are. If you break them, you're screwed. So you have to, understand the world in which you move and move respectfully within it.
The thing that you said about respecting rules, I finished reading Second Belt today.
Oh,
yeah. Thank you for. I was in a reading slump for like 2 months, and then I read Second Belt in like 48 hours. So thank you.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear that.
I'm really happy to, trust me. You touch upon, okay, so without going into any spoilers for the book, but one of the things that what you just said that has stuck with me from the book was the thing about empathy and the understanding. But also there's this thing about that I really liked when I realized what you were doing is basically suppressing parts of yourself because somebody tells you they're wrong, but they're not actually, you have no idea if they are or not, which I've found really fascinating because it can be mapped onto so many real life experiences and condition. Anybody trying to have anybody suppress a part of themselves, be it a personality trait or a skill or a preference or anything. I found really fascinating because the way you treat it is that I think that many authors who would deal with a supernatural creature like the striga would probably make it that I think there would be this temptation of doing that thing where a magical power or a skill or ability is evil by itself, which I did not get the impression that you did that. You did the thing that I really like. It's a tool, it's how you use it. No thing is inherently, no magical power or anything is inherently bad or good in itself. It's how you use it, which is, I think, a really nice motif that is threaded through the novel. Because at the start, it's really about, we need to banish them because they're evil. Why? And it turns out that this isn't a spoiler. This is pretty much obvious from the first page. Why? Well, because somebody really long ago said so, and we need to do this. And the same way when they find their community, which is also, for a moment there, I was really worried that you were going to stray into the cozy territory, and it's going to be a really nice utopia where all the strigas live. And it's, no, there's still human people with all the flaws.
There are no utopias in the Slavic world.
Yeah, indeed. So what I really liked there was how human they all were. And also that I'm really glad that you mentioned self-policing because that's another thing that really stuck with me. The whole, yes, we are different, but we mustn't be too different because they might notice. Even though they've banished us and we live here and we could theoretically be ourselves, but don't be too of yourself. Come on.
Too much of yourself. Like, it's you can exist, but I think the rules were imported as well from, because if you're operating from the point of, complete ignorance of something that does have a huge potential for good or evil, like I think it's very natural to be scared of it. And I think I didn't want the characters to seem ridiculous in that fear, because if someone is born with capabilities and abilities that can make them perform like feats of strength, or there is a risk in that. And I think not recognizing it would be just as silly, to be honest, in some respects. I think that there's also I'm quite interested in how people being sure of themselves affects their actions. And, the person who is the most certain that they're right, it's a dangerous thing. A human being that is sure that they're completely right, it's a very dangerous thing. In my opinion, and in every scenario, whether it's a leader or a mother or, so I think the people who have doubt and who are not certain are more likely to make right decisions in many scenarios.
I have a soft spot. I have soft spot for monstrous women from especially folklore and fairy tales, because it always seems to me people really just had problems with misogyny. So obviously women had to be at fault for something. If she was too pretty, that was a problem, of course. If she wasn't pretty, that's also a problem. And in Croatian, actually, the word štriga is used in one of our dialects as a synonym for a bitch. So if you wanted to say that...
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. If you want to say that your boss is a real bitch, you will say she's a real štriga. Yeah,
I think we also have a folk song for the carnival. I don't care that she's a štriga. I'm gonna marry her anyway, or something like it. I'm not sure. It's very explicit.
At least the way I approach these stories when I write, I always come with a sort of a subversion of this type of tales where I'm not really comfortable with just staying, let's say, accurate to the folk tales where women are evil just because they were born in a particular way.
I think, when we also read folk stories or, fairy tales, like I think it's also useful to remember how short those stories are. So you don't get context, like in a lot of fairy tales around the world anyway, like the main characters are often not named, right? You have a beautiful princess who lived far, far away. And then a handsome young man comes to tower, right? None of them are named. You don't know their backstory. You don't know, sometimes you might not know why she's in the tower. There's all those stories. And I think that is fair game to explore that. And I remember I was in a panel once on folklore, and one of the authors put it really beautifully, I thought, which is that every time you retell an old story, it's like new geological layer, right? You just add a tiny bit. And in terms of, how you approach it, I think it's all that's the interesting bit, right? When you talk about motivations for a character, like I've always been like a moral relativist, really. I think it's the most interesting way for me to approach those stories, because every action can be explained away given the right motivation, right? So the example I want to give of that is that you have country. So say you have a story of a country A and a country B that are at war, and you get the story of country A hero who breaks into the castle and kills the evil king, and hooray, the story ends. But you don't get the story of the gods and their families, right? The gods that he killed, and the gods' poor widow and orphans that are now having to navigate their occupied land of country B, as a country A comes in. And I think sometimes the old stories, especially the ones that really seek to vilify someone, there's a temptation to kind of just turn it around, because, well, okay, we can tell this story and then we can add more to it.
What are some of the typical villains, maybe in Polish folk tales?
So in Polish folk tales, so I would say that the typical villain is someone who is greedy, unhospitable, or someone who essentially breaks the rules, right? So a villain, and usually that breaking the rules comes from greed or trying to bend the rules, right? So we have a lot of stories where, a beggar comes to your door, and depending on how you treat them, that's what's going to happen to you. Because I think people lived very far apart. You were neighbors with someone who was 2 days walk away, so it made absolute sense to have this unspoken rule that someone came to your door, you could not send them away without giving them something to eat. Someone who would say, no, I don't have a space for a stinky old beggar, would usually get punished. So that's a kind of villain in a simple sense. But one of the most famous villains in Polish folklore is King Popiel and his wife. So basically they were worried that all of his distant relatives might make a move on his throne, and that they might usurp the power if he were to die. So his wife invites all of the frenemies from around the kingdom, right? And she poisons them. And so, she breaks the most fundamental rule of the Slavic world. She, broke bread with them, and then they poison them. And it's like the earth rises up against King Popiel and his family, and suddenly like a sea of mice come out from everywhere and start chasing them. And so King Popiel starts running away, and they're in a cart, and there's this like sea of mice behind them. And then he comes, he sends his wife one way, and he runs to the tower, but he sees from the top of the tower that the mice got to them and ate his sons and his wife. And then the mice come up on the sides of the tower and eat him as well, so we have this like King Popiel that was eaten by mice, right? And that's like one of the absolutely most famous stories in Poland, but is still preserved in this form, because that is a villain, someone who broke bread, someone who had made this agreement with you, and then he betrayed you.
This is fascinating. Because when you started talking about his wife killing all of his
Yeah.
frenemies, as you said, I was like,
Relatives.
oh, Lady Macbeth. But then mice came into the picture, and I really think that Macbeth as a play would benefit from like a
Yes,
horde of
I
mice
mean,
or rats or something.
you know what? I feel like Shakespeare first plagiarized it and then missed the trick.
You know, if Guillermo del Toro ever does a Shakespearean play, he should put some folkloric monsters
Yeah.
into it, like huge
Should
rats
I
and
should I email him, or will
yeah.
you slide in your
Yeah.
demons?
Yeah, this is really cool story. But this reminded me, is there some story or maybe something from the folklore that you want to use, but you didn't have a chance to write something yet?
Honestly, I'm such a magpie. If I see something I like, I instantly find a space for it. So I can't say that there's something that, especially I have to say, the children's books gave me a lot of space to sort of really. I think maybe I would like to write more about the home spirits and the kind of like the politics between the spirits of the home. So there's the good ones, there's the bad ones, there's the really weird ones, like the one called nędza, which is like, it means like poverty but with misery, like poverty and misery. And what it does is basically, it's like it acts like an infection, right? So it comes in and it infects you, and your home will be poorer and unhappy, and there'll be just terrible things happening to you until you pass it on to someone else. So I think that would be a very
This sounds like a great setup for a haunted house.
Yes, I mean it could be, right? So
You
I
carry
suppose
the
that
haunting with you.
so that could be an interesting sort of route to follow.
I had a subtweet question about plagiarism. It's not really plagiarism. Just before we started recording officially, you said like you were so happy to talk to Slavic people about fantasy and books and publishing. So my question would be, without stating any facts, naming any names, etc., if you could like remove one thing people do when writing Slavic fantasy about Slavic inspired characters, people, magic systems, geography, etc.
I'm not sure I would take away. I'm not big on the whole cultural appropriation thing for myself. Like I can't speak for everybody, but I actually really enjoy it when people are inspired by my heritage or want to know more about it. I really enjoy it.
Okay.
I'm really like I'm always excited to talk about folklore with other Slavs, because this is something that you guys grew up with as well. So that will always provide a slightly different perspective. But I think when it comes to the books that sort of at least ostensibly claim to be inspired by Slavic folklore, the thing I would love to address is just how much of it is inspired by like a single volume of Russian folk stories, like the one that like, the Ivan Bilibin one, like which I love. I grew up reading it, but I just feel like a lot of when people think Slavic, they think Russian. And Russian culture and Russian traditions are very interesting, and I'm not, current political situation notwithstanding, there's a lot there, of course, but I would love it if people delve deeper. So I think I've read books in the past where they claimed on the cover that they were inspired by Slavic folklore, and literally the only inspiration I could find was that literally one of the characters was called Vlad or something. And I feel like, well, that is such a missed opportunity, and if you're saying that you're actually inspired by something, I would love to see some evidence of real interest. And I think I want more. You are like, people are welcome to my culture, but I want them to show that they respect it and that they actually enjoy it, rather than just like ticking a box for exoticism,
Yeah. Sometimes I also have this feeling that someone Googled, I don't know, Slavic creatures, went onto Wikipedia page, found Rusalka, and that's that.
Although, like with Wikipedia, I was a little bit surprised. Someone linked to me. So there's the story of the Zoryas. That is Russian, right? But like, so I included the Zorya's stories, the sisters, the sort of star sisters in my children's book. But I changed it to like three sisters, because in this story it's two, Zorya Utrennyaya and Zorya Vechernyaya. and I changed it like it's added a night sister as well. And now it exists on Wikipedia and it's linked to my book as a source. And I feel like a criminal. I'm just like, oh my God, like I have falsified data. Oh no,
No. What you did, you've unlocked the next level, which is you become the source.
Yes, but it's like, it's a kid's book. Like, let's be for real a little bit. Like, so,
The forbidden sister.
yeah, like I don't even have a page on Wikipedia. I have not reached the Wikipedia level stardom, my friends, right? But the one time I am on Wikipedia, it's like linking to something I made up and it's quoted as like the source material. I was like, that's not, it reflects poorly, I would say.
Somebody's going to research Slavic mythology and end up on the night sister.
But this is how you will know that someone referenced you and not the real like mythology. If you notice someone else using
you
the
mean
third sister.
the older geological layer of mythology.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yes.
So technically, if anybody else writes about the third sister, you could sue them for plagiarizing you.
That's true. Yes,
And
that is my Zorya.
And flipping the coin to authors with a Slavic background. Like, let's like make a bigger umbrella, not just say like Slavic authors, but authors of Slavic backgrounds. Do you have any
recommendations?
Down-to-earth survival tactics in writing, in fantasy, in publishing, in
English?
If you had a younger relative or a younger sibling who wanted to write and publish in English, what would you tell them?
Well, one of the things is be prepared that English people will miss a lot of context. So you have to be, if you're writing for a different sort of cultural audience, even if you speak, you talk to the English speaking audience. So you have to be a bit more explicit about certain things. I had one editor try to change the endings of all the surnames, because he was like, well, you have to decide one, like, are they this like Czech, or is it Uvna, or are they like Ova? I was like, we change the endings of the surnames. So like, then I had to come through the book because he changed it all. So I had this, and I had another question of an editor questioning why the character had so many aunties and uncles.
Yeah.
And so there's that, and a lot of it is not a bad deal. Like, it's not a big deal, right? This is because I can explain it, and then it's all great. But difficulty is if that affects your chances of publication, which it might, because the editor will be, if an English editor reads your book and finds a context unbelievable, like, why would I've had a slightly different, but a friend of mine who is Ghanaian British wrote a book with a kind of multi-generational household, and the feedback she was getting was that it's kind of almost like, oh, it's just too many people in the household, that's just unbelievable, like, why would you have like, and this is the stuff that they said to her, and the stuff that they didn't say to her might be the problem, right? So there's also an element of you have to be prepared for being tokenized. And it depends how wide an interest your story is, I guess. And it's hard. Like, I've had people like reject my books because they said, and that happened a few times. It's like, oh, thank you, we love this book, but we already have something Slavic on our list. So it's like, we have ticked this box. It might be about a completely different thing. It's like, a Slavic is not a genre description, but that is also a difficulty, possibly. So, just you have to write the best book you can and hope for the best. It's a very difficult industry. I don't know what the market looks like in Croatia, but it's hard out there. The publishing world takes no prisoners.
We talked with also a colleague, Jelena Dunato, who also mentioned the troubles with
lists,
marketing, and the way that marketing tries to put you in a neat box. And like for her stories, because she's from Croatia, she's a Slavic person, so it's a Slavic fantasy because it has inspiration from here, but also there's a lot more to it.
A lot of Venice and a lot of like Western and Adriatic influences
Yeah.
and it doesn't fit the Slavic box.
Yeah, but she still put the Slavic box. So
I think it's important, like especially like I see it like so it's hard. There's a balance to it because not every editor will react favorably to authors' ideas, but especially now that publishers expect us to market ourselves a lot more, it's important to try and take charge of your narrative a little bit around yourself, because so the thing that publishers never tell debuts is that the kind of big marketing push when they're pushing you as a debut, that happens once, and they're not really interested in building your brand. That is something you have to do. And of course, the marketing they do, you can then take advantage of it to help you with that initial push to build your brand. But you have to be very careful with that, and you have to be more strategic than I have been in my career. In the sense, like so I have friends who are authors, but they approach the publisher with the best of intentions. They were told, we love this book, set it up for a series. We want to make it a series, and so the book ended on a cliffhanger. But it was promoted as a standalone, because the publisher thought, okay, let's test the waters. Maybe this will be a breakthrough offer for us. If so, we can continue with the series, right? But then they did not. And they loved the next idea by this offer. And they was like, yes, fantastic. Let's, this is definitely a series material. Ended on a cliffhanger. Again, it was marketed as standalone, right? So the readers don't blame the publisher, right? They think it's like, oh, it's yet another series offer that never completed a series. Maybe he got bored. I think, your editors can be, I've met some wonderful, I've worked with some wonderful people, but as institutions, you have to also be aware that you need to operate as if you were not to get another book deal with this person, because whether or not you will doesn't really depend on the quality of the work. This editor might leave. I have friends who went through 3 different editors, because from the moment they were signed till the moment they were published, 3 editors came and left, and suddenly nobody knew what the book is about. So I think being strategic and kind of trying to position yourself from the get-go and positioning your book in the right way is very important.
You mentioned that you also self-published a book.
Yes.
Was it hard to go from traditional publishing to self-publishing? How did you choose that?
So I kind of went in a little roundabout way. So I kind of eased myself into it, because I did an anthology in 2024 that I crowdfunded. So I also do art, right? So I do linocut prints. And basically the story is, a friend of mine asked oh, I like this Ghanaian one you did. Maybe I'll write a story for it. We'll try to sell it, to a magazine. And I was driving in a car when the message popped up, and I was like, let's think bigger. And I contacted 20 people that's would you like to do an anthology together? This is the kind of illustrations I do. Would you like to do that? And they all said yes. And so within 24 hours, I realized that I had signed myself up for a huge amount of work. I did not think it through, and we did. I mean, it came out lovely. The work of it was ruining my life for a year, but but it was great. Which the work well. Right, it's trying to put together 20 or so things. So hats off to you guys for doing it. But it's a huge amount of work, and it was with training wheels on, because we had a partnership with Matt, the owner of Broken Binding online bookshop and now publisher as well of special editions. And he's a really great guy, and he offered to kind of help us with the distribution. So that really helped with the self-publishing element. So when I had the romance, I thought, okay, so publishing industry professionals are telling me that historical does not sell now. So nobody will buy it because they don't want to buy historical. So I was like, okay, so I'll do it myself. And it was really hard, and it doesn't get easier, but it's also a really interesting process. And it's a process that is it's very dynamic. The things change all the time. There's new apps that come up and suddenly become really popular, and there's new platforms, and old platforms succumb to the enshittification process and become unusable, and you suddenly have to pivot. And it relies a lot more on working directly with people who can be wonderful or can be completely, unresponsive. So that was interesting, reaching out to people, making more connections. And, it's, I suppose it's even more rewarding when someone reads the book that is like, it's purely you. And I had an editor, but aside from that, it's like, I laid it out, I illustrated it, it's very rewarding when it does work and people do enjoy it, but it's really hard.
Do you have plans to continue with self-publishing, or was it just for this historical romance?
So I want to write a volume 2 for it, about like a kind of different couple in the same world, just because it's so enjoyable to write. It's very different to my usual writing in that it's much lighter, it's wittier, and I do enjoy writing like funny dialogue here and there. So it's a different kind of challenge, because writing a romance well is actually quite hard. And I don't want to half-ass anything I do. But it's writing about people, right? And you want to create characters that are compelling and that are, three-dimensional, and they all have their, and you're creating a story of how two imperfect beings come together. And that is enjoyable in some way, especially as like in my other novels, I tend to focus on like mother-daughter love stories and community love stories. So it's a different challenge.
I have a hunch we're like winding down, perhaps a bit, slightly. We always ask our guests whether there was something you expected us to ask you and we didn't, or if there's something like you'd like to tell us.
I think you've been very thorough.
So we just had to ask you for one final favor. At the end of every episode, we have a question from us or from our guests to the audience. And people actually respond to us. They send us emails, they send us DMs. And the honor to ask the question tonight in this episode obviously lies with you. So is there anything you would like to know about somebody who has just listened to this show?
Is your audience mostly Croatian?
Mm-hmm. Yes, Croatian and neighboring countries, but mostly Croatian.
So what would they like to see in their local writing, in the like stories from Croatia or from wherever they are, that would make them more interested in reading local stories? So what change would they like to see? What do they not get? What do they not get that they would like to get?
Our dear audience, please send us the answer or answers.
Yeah. And can you tell us where can our audience find you?
So I have a website, gabrielahouston.com, and I have a Substack as well, from which I mostly send my newsletter. So that's Gabriela Houston as well on Substack. I'm on Instagram less and less these days because it makes me sad. But I'm very much contactable.
So, dear audience, send us your answers to morinakutia@gmail.com or @morinakutia on Facebook and Instagram. I'll always say točka even when I'm talking in English because this sentence is really ingrained in my mind. We always finish up episode with šaljite nam odgovore na. So I always tell gmail.com for some reason. Yeah. But I feel like people who are listening probably understand.
No, and you probably have it in the description.
So thank you very much for this episode. This was such an interesting topic, and I'm a bit tired, but yeah, I just really loved speaking with you, and I hope our audience will also have fun listening to it. And please send us all your comments, not just answers, if you want to say something to Gabriela. And of course, in the description, there are going to be links to your books as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, guys. This has been really fun.